Hey guys, JackischMTG here, and I've got to tell you, I am so excited for tomorrow's Dominaria patch on Magic the Gathering Arena. We're getting a slew of changes to the client and some economy changes as well. And the most exciting thing for me personally, even more so than having access to Dominaria, is the fact that we're getting events. That's right, we're getting events, and that is what we'll be talking about on today's video. The first event, which starts tomorrow, will be Quick Constructed, followed by Hour of Devastation Quick Draft and Dominaria Quick Draft on the following 2 weeks. But what's important to know is that Quick Constructed will be running from tomorrow all the way until June 7th. So if by the time you're viewing this video, it is already April 26th, quick events are available for you. So one of the things I wanted to focus on in today's video is what the event prizes are and why you should care about playing these events. If you look here, the first set of rewards for 0 to 7 wins is for the constructed queue, whereas the second set of wins is for the draft queue. Now, if you look, you see that the entry fee here for the constructed queue is 500 gold or 95 gems, which means that if you can go 4 and 3 consistently, you can theoretically go infinite on your entries. That is to say, you get your entry cost back to you, and you're getting a reward on top of that, which would be 2 uncommon cards and a rare card. Now, what's important to know here is that a 4 and 3 record consistently is going to give you about a 57% win rate. So if you're playing constructed queues tomorrow or any time during which the constructed queues are available, that means you have to have a pretty serious competitive deck. And that's why I'm making this video for today. I've got 2 different game plans across 3 decks that I think will have a significant advantage in the best of 1 queues. And that's what this is going to be, is we're going to have best of 1 matches. And so with that being said, we need to employ all strategies available to us to increase our win rate. Now, if you go with me over to this page here, what you see in front of you is my Aether Hub deck list page. I've been making a concerted effort to publish decks that I think would be helpful for my viewers who might not be as experienced when it comes to their deck building skills and still care about having the ability to play a really awesome, fun, and competitive deck. So what you see in front of you, if you couldn't tell already, we've got 3 very obvious decks. We've got blue-black control, blue-white approach, and red deck wins. And I know you're going to be like, Mike, come on. You're not being original. What's going on here? Well, I've got to tell you, there's a reason why these decks are so good right now in the best of 1 queues. Red deck wins is honestly just the most aggressive thing possible. If you look at constructed play in normal paper MTG and Moto tournaments, you'll see that the decks with the highest win rate game 1 are red deck wins, right? They consistently across multiple formats have some of the highest game 1 win rates. And the reason for that is there's a bit of a balance there, right? So in best of 3s, there's game 2 and game 3 theoretically where the opponent has the ability to sideboard in cards to deal with the aggressive opponent in front of them. That's not the case with MTG Arena. We don't have the ability to sideboard in, at least not yet, for best of 3 matches because they aren't there. So knowing that we're only competing in best of 1s, I think red deck wins is an incredible starting point for trying to select a deck that will maximize your win rate. Now with both the blue-black control and the blue-white approach list here, we get to take advantage of the best of 1 format in a bit of a different way. When you look through both of these lists, you'll see that there's not really much in the way of creatures for your opponent to try and use the removal on. And so effectively what that does is it means that your opponent often has a bunch of removal just sitting in their hand doing nothing. Now in best of 3 formats, players have sideboards so they can swap out the useless cards and bring in something more relevant for their matchup. But again, this is best of 1, so if they have a ton of removal and you don't have anything to remove, it's just going to sit in their hand doing nothing while you're actually drawing something more relevant to play. Now, the other reason why we like blue-black control and blue-white approach here for the constructed event queues is that you are able to play predominantly at instant speed. The advantage of instant speed is that you are able to see more of what your opponent does before you make a decision on which card to play, right? So instead of playing something on turn 3, you get to see what your opponent does first before you spend your 3 mana. Having the ability to play at instant speed just gives you an inherent advantage of knowing more of what your opponent's doing before you actually have to commit to a decision. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and just jump into one of the lists, and let's just start with red deck wins. Okay, so we have our red deck wins list here. You'll notice that for the most part, it's very similar to what you've been seeing prior to Dominaria, but with a few notable changes. But before I show you those changes, just wanted to show the cards that really matter the most in this deck are going to be your On-Crop Crasher, your Earthshaker Kenra, your Hazoret the Fervent. Beyond that, we really care about Lightning Strike and Magma Spray. They're very efficient burn cards. And Ramming Up Ruins and Sunscorched Desert offer an uncounterable, uninteractable way of closing out the game if you've completely run out of steam and don't have much left to finish off your opponent. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the new cards from Dominaria. Here we have Wizard's Lightning, which is ultimately a conditional Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt was a 1-red instant spell that dealt 3 damage, and so that's what we've got here with Wizard's Lightning. You just have to have a wizard on the field. Fortunately, in mono red, we actually have access to a lot of wizards. You don't have to run red-blue in order to have enough wizards to make this card work, and so we'll show that to you in just a second here. The second card is the Flame of Keld. I find this card really interesting. I'm not sure if it's actually worth playing, but at least as a one-of, it's not bad, right? Because it can be the last card in your hand, and that first effect of discarding your hand doesn't really hurt you, right? When this card is the last card in your hand, it effectively just becomes a draw 2 effect, just with a bit of a delay. And then finally, on that third event in the saga, being able to double your damage from all red sources. I mean, we've got a total of 8 burn spells, and we've also got access to tons of hasty creatures and other ways to deal damage. And so I'm just interested to see how effective it really ends up being in practice. Magma Spray makes the list simply because it's the most efficient way to remove your opponent's early blockers. Now, Soulscar Mage is here because it is a wizard for the purposes of Wizard's Lightning, has prowess, and that second ability, which is oftentimes very relevant. First off, it's just really good against opposing mid-range decks. Another way that this ability is very useful is for cards like Champion of Wits that really care about the total power on the card when the trigger resolves. If you use a burn spell on opposing Champion of Wits in response to that draw trigger, you're able to reduce their power, and so when it checks for the power of Champion of Wits, it's going to see that the power is 0 or less when you use one of your burn spells here, and thus your opponent, if your opponent does choose to activate the You May ability, they're going to draw 0 cards and discard 2. So oftentimes, it's just a very efficient way for you to be able to deal with Champion of Wits and prevent your opponent from sculpting your hand and finding things to deal with what you're trying to employ. And finally, we've got our maybes. We've got Captain Lannery, Captivating Crew, Charging Monster Sword, Daring Buccaneer, Fanatical Firebrand, Gitu Journey Mage, Glorybringer, Nest Robber, Rekindling Phoenix, and Abrade. All these cards are very good to just kind of good, and I've just listed them here in case you guys don't have access to all of these cards on this list. Obviously, MTG Arena is more of a journey than it is a go out and buy a deck list, although some of you will now have access to buying what you want through gems, but I just wanted to at least make sure that there are some alternatives here. So if you do swap any of the cards here, just be mindful of your curve. Try to make sure that you swap the appropriate mana cost card. So if you only have 3 Earthshaker Kenras and you want to add another 2 mana creature, make sure you're not adding, I don't know, Glorybringer in that slot. Now, if you'll notice that Glorybringer is a 5 mana card, I don't have any 5 mana cards in our original curve, and that's because I want to make sure that this deck was as low to the ground and efficient as possible. And so just keep that in mind, that if you want to expand your curve a bit and go a little bit higher, that's totally fine. That's entirely up to you. It's not incorrect. It's just different from what I was trying to accomplish here with this list. But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump over to the control lists. All right, and here's our blue-black control list. As you can see, we have a bunch of instants available to us. Again, I really enjoy the draw-go playstyle. It gives us more options. It gives us more information before we have to commit to making a decision. And so that's why we have a really big focus on playing instants. You'll see for our game closers, we have Nezahal Primal Tide, 1 copy. That's really just meant for the opposing control lists. I think there will be a lot of control in the field and a lot of aggro decks. Scarab God is there to compete against aggro and mid-range. It's just a really good closer for those matchups. And then as for new cards from Dominaria, we have Syncopate and Cast Down. I'm significantly more interested and high on Syncopate than I am on Cast Down. I'm a little concerned that initially Cast Down will kind of be just an iffy card because of that non-legendary clause. The reason why I say that is Cast Down tends to be better against the mid-range decks that are being built right now. With aggro, you generally just want a Moment of Craving there. Moment of Craving is going to give you more incremental life gain. And then when it comes to playing against opposing control decks, a lot of the finishers for control decks are stuff like Scarab God or Nezahal or Azor, or there's just a ton of legendary creatures that are used as finishers right now. And so ultimately in those matchups, Cast Down does nothing for you. Now, as for land, you'll see here that we don't really have any of the rare dual lands, the Drowned Catacomb or the, the Fetid Pools. And the reason why I didn't include those there is because I know that many of you are hurting for rare wildcards and you're trying to spend your rare wildcards on the things that you actually cast rather than your land base. And so with you guys in mind, I've intentionally left those out and tried to shape this deck so that the mana is as correct as possible for you guys. If you do have access to those cards, absolutely 100% sub out some islands and swamps and play those instead. Just know that if you're going to play the cycling land, you're just not going to want to play 4 copies of Evolving Wilds and 4 copies of Fetid Pools because of the fact that it's going to enter the battlefield tapped and oftentimes will get in the way of you being able to play your cards consistently. Ipnu Rivulet is in the deck because we want to have the ability to interact with a deck like Approach of the Second Sun. If your opponent plays Approach and it resolves, goes to the 7th card from the top of the deck, you can just be sure to keep track of where it is in the deck and try to mill the Approach rather than letting the opposing control deck draw it and then win the game with it. Now, as for cards in our maybe board, we have quite a few options here for you. Let's start with Reaver Ambush. Reaver Ambush is here because of that exile effect. One of the things that I really like about Syncopate and Vraska's Contempt is the fact that they both exile. And the reason why that's interesting or notable is because with Commit to Memory, you can effectively spend most of the game exiling your opponent's threats. And then when you cast Memory later in the game, your opponent's not shuffling those threats back into their deck, but you're shuffling your sources of removal back into yours. And so you're effectively neutering your opponent because they're only shuffling in, like Evolving Wilds or little tiny threats that really didn't have much of an impact for you. And then at the same time, you're getting a full reload of all of your control spells. So all in all, I think that Reaver Ambush is an interesting option in the 3-mana slot. Of course, we have Negate. Negate's very obvious if you're up against a bunch of control decks or you just feel like you need a little more of an edge against the heavy spell decks, then this could be a very good option for you. Moment of Craving is primarily for the opposing aggro decks. There's a very good chance that this needs to be a 4 of in the deck. There's a possibility that, again, the cast downs are incorrect. I just have them in there because they're interesting from Dominaria, but there is a real possibility that I'll be swapping those for the meta. Golden Mise is there because, again, it's just really good against aggro. I think aggro is going to be the bee's knees early on, so we want to be able to be prepared for that. Duress, great against control. So if we see the meta trend towards control, then I definitely would consider adding 1 or 2 copies into the deck. Doomfall serves 2 purposes here. One, you can pick out the most potent card in your opponent's hand and just exile it from the game. Again, that works with our Commit to Memory game plan. And then also Doomfall gives you the ability to deal with Carnage Tyrant, which is one of the biggest pains for control decks to play against. Not being counterable and not being targetable makes Doomfall a very valuable thing to have. And so if you start playing against a bunch of Carnage Tyrants, this could be a great way to hedge against that risk. Cast Down we already talked about. Bontu's Last Reckoning, I don't really see this being a good card to play, but there is a possibility that could be dead wrong about my prediction that the meta will be mostly aggro and mostly control. And so if the meta kind of shifts towards being primarily mid-range or the go-wide token decks, Bontu's Last Reckoning would be a whole lot better in that world. And finally, we have Glyph Keeper and Champion of Wits. Both of these cards are really interesting and kind of have a similar place in my mind. I'm a little concerned that the Embalm and Eternalize effects are not going to be as good this time around because Dominaria introduces even more exile effects that we have to work with. And so I think with exile being more and more relevant, you're going to see decks like Godpharaoh's Gift, decks with Champion of Wits, Glyph Keepers, and so on. They're not going to be as strong as they have been prior to Dominaria. But with that being said, Glyph Keeper is a really awesome alternative to Scarab God. If you don't have your 2 copies of Scarab God, I would certainly consider running 1 Scarab God, 1 Glyph Keeper, or even 2 Glyph Keepers, because they can definitely finish out the game. Champion of Wits, again, I'm concerned that it's not going to be as good with all the exile effects, removing Eternalize and Embalm abilities from the graveyard, but it's still a really good card, right? Sculpt your hand by drawing 2 and then discarding the 2 most... It gives you the ability to sculpt your hand by allowing you to draw 2 and then discard the 2 least relevant cards in your hand. And then, of course, later on in the game, you're able to draw 4, discard 2, which is extremely powerful. One thing that you want to keep in mind when playing Golden Demise, Duress, Doomfall, Bontu's Last Reckoning, and Champion of Wits is that these cards are really strong early on, but it does get in the way of your ability to play at instant speed. And so if you are comfortable not playing Drago, that's fine. Just know that if you have a preference for Drago or you see the value in playing Drago, know that you're going to have to commit to making your decision to cast the card before having the opportunity to see what your opponent's playing. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get on to our last list, which is the blue-white approach list. Okay, so here's our blue-white approach list. Again, you see Nezahal as our threat that is intended to close out the game against opposing control lists. You've got our 2 Approach of the Second Sons, which generally is going to be our way of winning against any other deck. Although Nezahal can win against other decks if you're able to shut down your opponent. And then, of course, you have a lot of our instant speed effects. Now, one thing you'll notice is we don't have the commit to memory in here. And the reason for that is all of our exile effects require that the cards stay on the battlefield, right? With the exception of Syncopate, obviously. But you know, Cast Out and Seal Away, which is one of the new cards from Dominaria, they require that the enchantments stick on the board. And so commit to memory is significantly less valuable in this case because we don't have as many exile effects where the card that exiled also goes to our graveyard. As for ways to draw cards and get more value out of our deck and grind the opponent out, we've got Treasure Maps, Search for Azcanta, and Pull from Tomorrow. There's a real possibility that there needs to be some hieroglyphic eliminations in here, but for right now I don't have them in there. But it's certainly an option to add. As you can see here, I'm trying to keep the curve more weighted towards your early game because I think aggro is going to be a significant threat against the control decks, and so you need to be able to be ready for those decks. Another thing that's different is we have Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Teferi is one of the new cards out of Dominaria. Of course, it's in the name. And I just think there's a real possibility that when you're able to stick a Teferi on the field, that you've pretty much locked the game down. He kind of benefits our instant speed game plan in that you're able to cast him on, say, turn 7 for 5 mana, activate his +1, and pass the turn. Now you have 4 mana available for the opponent's turn to play your counterspell, to play your cast out, whatever it may be. I really like the fact that he untaps land with that draw effect because it gets us more value and enables us to keep on with our draw-go game plan. Ipnu Rivulet, we discussed that in the blue-black control lists. This is to mill ourselves to get deeper into the deck and closer to our Approach of the Second Sun after we've put it 7 cards down, or it's a way to interact with our opponent's Approach of the Second Sun in the mirror match. Finally, we've got our maybes. Champion of Wits we discussed in the blue-black control list. I have a concern it's not going to be as good moving forward. It's still good, but it also requires us to play at sorcery speed. It requires us to play a creature, which again turns on the opponent's removal. And so all in all, I'm not super high on Champion of Wits for draw-go control decks because of that. We've got Regal Caracal. This is a really awesome option if you want a different creature to close out the game with. You don't have to necessarily run Nezahal. You can run Regal Caracal as well. It gives you some life gain. It gives you 3 bodies for 1 card. And what's important about the 3 bodies thing is that your opponent likely won't be able to kill all 3 with targeted removal while you have counterspells in your hand. Obviously, if they have a board wipe, that's one thing, but you also still have counterspells again. So they'll need 2 board wipes if you're playing your Regal Caracal on turn 8, for example, and you have a cancel as backup. Another card in our maybes is a 3rd copy of Approach of the Second Sun. If you don't want to do any creatures and you want to make the opponent's removal completely useless, go ahead and consider playing the 3rd Approach of the Second Sun. Just know that if you're against other control decks, there's a real possibility that Approach is going to be a difficult and tall order to resolve because of the fact that they're going to have more mana available to win the counter war. So you're going to have to grind them out really good in order to make Approach of the Second Sun work as a win condition. Next, we have Farm to Market. Farm to Market is a great 3-mana removal card that also gives you the option to filter your hand later on with the Aftermath effect. And then we have Hieroglyphic Illumination. We don't have any Hieroglyphic Illuminations in the deck right now. There's a real possibility that that just needs to be in there as multiple copies. But for right now, because I was on a time crunch to try and get this content out to you guys, and I wanted to provide something that had a lower to the ground curve and still some really good removal and 4, I chose not to try and add more copies than what we had. Again, you might be able to tick this up a bit, but I just want to make sure we had more things to do early on against the opposing aggro decks. I really think that those aggro decks are going to be quite an issue early on, and so you have to be prepared for those. Ixalan's Binding, again, this is like a cast out, but at sorcery speed with the benefit of shutting down any future copies of whatever you remove. And so, again, the reason why we don't want to use Ixalan's Binding necessarily is because of the fact that cast out is instant and Ixalan's Binding is sorcery speed. And then next we have Thematic Compass. This card's interesting in that it makes your Settle the Wreckages a little more potent. Your opponent's going to have to commit 1 extra creature to the attack in order to get around Thematic Compass. And so it makes playing around Settle the Wreckage a lot more difficult for your opponents. And then finally we've got Gideon of the Trials. Gideon also serves a similar role to Thematic Compass, but then with the added benefit of potentially being a way to close out the game with a 4/4 beater. So if you do successfully lock down your opponent and they don't have any threats on the board, you can easily turn Gideon into a 5-turn clock. And that about does it for this video. I'll be sure to have links to all the decks and my deck list page in the comment section down below, as well as links to my Twitch and Twitter, where you can follow me on those respective platforms if that's your thing. If you liked this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you have any questions, be sure to ask them there. Or if you'd like some live dialogue, hop on the Twitch live stream. I make a very concerted effort to address all questions that my viewers might have, and so I'll do my best to help you out in any way possible. But in closing, thank you again for watching. I hope you have a great start to your Dominaria collection, and may you go infinite in all of your event queues. Take care.